Hello. Let's see who's... Okay, we're going to get started in just a couple of moments. Give people a chance to get on. I uploaded, for those of you who can see, the source sheets is on Facebook itself. If you happen to have a Sefer Chinuch with you, you can... Hey, Rachel. My sister is watching from overseas. Nice to see you. Anyway, if you'd like to follow the source sheets, you can see them that they've been uploaded onto the Facebook page. If you happen to have your own Sefer Chinuch, the Book of Education, which is the book that we're using for this class, it goes through all 613 commandments in the chronological order in which the mitzvah appears. We're going to look primarily at mitzvah number 93. Last week we had spoken about some of the laws of kashrut with mitzvah number 92, meat and milk, and now we are moving on to mitzvah number 93, which talks about not to cut a treaty, not to have a treaty, create a covenant, a brit, with people who are part of the 7 nations, the 7 indigenous nations of the land of Canaan. We'll speak about those specific ones in a little bit. Not to create a covenant with them. We'll also look at mitzvah number 425, which sort of steps it up a little bit in terms of our animosity with those 7 nations. Mitzvah number 93 says don't create any type of covenant with them. Mitzvah number 425 says that you should destroy and kill them. And we'll talk about what that means in today's day and age, and how we can, if we can, distinguish it from ethnic cleansing or genocide or anything of the sorts like that. I am going to distinguish it, but it certainly is a question that is there whenever we talk about the 7 nations. Now, one of the issues that I think we have to sort of get out of the way right away is the point that there's really 2 ways of looking at this mitzvah, not to create a treaty with the 7 indigenous nations of the land of Canaan. One of them is political, right? We've returned to the land of Israel, and there seems to be a Torah prohibition from creating a peace treaty with some type of people. And the question then becomes a political one, a national one. And the alternative way of looking at this mitzvah is to look at it as a mitzvah related more towards the personal, more towards something spiritual. And I'm going to look at the latter. I'm going to view this mitzvah more from a personal point of view, a spiritual point of view. Part of it, of course, is because once you focus on the political and the national elements, you have some very difficult questions that I'm not sure are so easy to answer, such as, well, the people who live in the land today, are they descendants of the 7 nations? And what then are our obligations in our relationship to them? That's a challenging question, both morally as well as, of course, just technically. But the other reason why I want to focus on the personal and the spiritual aspect of this mitzvah is because I think it's a much deeper and richer way of understanding the particular mitzvah. And I would go even a step further, that if you understand what this mitzvah is really all about, then you will also be able to understand it on a political national level, and actually gives us as a nation a challenge of what we should actually try to accomplish. Okay, so that's the overview. We're going to focus more on the spiritual element of the mitzvah, but eventually we'll come back around to some political aspect. So the mitzvah starts, mitzvah number 93. I should maybe, before I get started, just also point out there's some good news here, of course. You'll notice I'm back in our shul. We are slowly beginning to normal life, and hopefully one day soon we can all be here together. Mitzvah number 93 starts, Lo shelo likrot brit. It uses the word brit, the same word we use, for example, brit milah, and that will become important near the end of the class. that you should not cut a covenant, not establish a treaty with the Shiva Amimim, the 7 nations that are here in the land of Canaan. V'chein, and similarly, l'chol oved avodat elilim, and similarly, anyone who's engaged in idol worship. In other words, the prohibition seems to really be against idol worship, but the core is, or the source of that is the 7 nations themselves. And we have to understand what's unique about them in that regard. I'm now switching to the English. We don't make a covenant, meaning to say that we do not promise our friendship, our love, to the bad nation of heretics, which are the 7 nations in the Torah, which are holding our land before arriving there. And these are the Hittite, the Amorite, and we'll see others, the Gibeonite, the Gershonite, the Yevusi, and so forth. We'll talk about those specifically a little bit later. As it's stated in Shemot 23:32, you shall not make a covenant with them and their gods. Okay, that's the literal Torah pasuk. Lo tichat lehem ve'elehem brit. You do not cut with them and their gods a covenant, which is to say, you do not make peace with them and leave them to worship idolatry. Okay, so you're not supposed to make peace with these seven nations. The roots of the commandment is to destroy idolatry. Right? It really seems that the essence of the mitzvah is not just these 7 nations, but idolatry. That's our real concern. But these 7 nations have a unique connection with idolatry. Now, before I talk about the unique connection that they have with idolatry, I should point out that we've spoken about idolatry before and the problems with it, not just theologically, but even more so than that, morally, what idolatry leads to. And we'll talk about it again sometime as well, but I want to sort of focus on what's unique about the 7 nations in this regard. The Sefer Chinuch goes on and tells us what's the unique problem of idolatry and the 7 nations. And these 7 nations were the center of idolatry and its first foundation. And because of this, they were uprooted from their land. In other words, they are more connected to idolatry than any other nations around the world. What makes them worse is that they are the worst in terms of their connection to idolatry. And if you look at sort of a number of historical sources, you could see some of the terrible things that they were engaged in. They had the fertility cult, which involved temple prostitutes, because they thought they were able to convince the gods, the Baal, and Asherah, his mother, and Anat, his sister, that if they somehow merged themselves, the temple prostitutes and the priests, that they would somehow force the gods to merge as well and to create fertility. If you want to get a real sense of all those type of issues, is just look at Vayikra, because if you look at Vayikra in chapter 18, for example, many of the prohibitions that we have of the Jewish people, not to engage in incest, adultery, bestiality, most significantly, not to sacrifice our own children, those are all in response and reaction to the fact of what was taking place in the land at the time. It's not for nothing that these are the prohibitions. These are the prohibitions because this was what was common in the land, and we should distinguish ourselves from the idolatry and the practices of these idolaters. So these particular nations were particularly bad, and this is the source of all idolatry, which raises, I think, an interesting challenge. Why is the land of Canaan, why is the land of Israel so connected to idolatry? Rav Hirsch makes this point, in fact. Rav Hirsch says that the land of Canaan was more depraved than any other land in the world. He says it's rooted, of course, already in the time of Noah. Noah has a son, Ham, who has a son, Canaan. And Ham embarrasses and disgraces his father, Noah. And in that verse in Breshit, which is 9:22, Genesis, even though Ham has other children, it specifically mentions when he disgraces his father, it mentions his son Canaan. And so that's the source of it, says Rav Hirsch. And so it's more depraved than any other place in the world. But at the same time, that's specifically the place where Avram has to be sent, which is a conundrum of sorts. The most holy place in the world is also the most depraved place in the world. And that's where Avram has to be. And why is that? What are we supposed to learn from that? Why not go to a place that is a little bit more even-keeled? and there try to spread to the world. Why start at this much more difficult and challenging place in the land of Canaan? Okay. To get to that answer, I want to sort of return to what I started to say, that the antagonism the Torah has towards the seven nations goes beyond simply verse number 93. Mitzvah number 93 speaks about not to create a covenant with these nations. If you want to continue the reading, I'm in the second paragraph, the third line. Not only are we not allowed to have a covenant with them, we were commanded to uproot them and to destroy their memory forever, as is written about them in the Torah in Deuteronomy. This is where the mitzvah appears again later on in the Torah. You shall surely annihilate them. Now, we're going to have to look at that word annihilate. It becomes very important later. And that it is a positive commandment in the order of V'etchanan, and there I will write at length about this commandment with God's help, and tell the reason for why these bad nations are in the world, and that this commandment is included in the commandments that are practiced. It's an interesting reference that the Sefer Chinuch just made. He feels that he has to justify why these bad nations exist in the world. Why would God allow them to exist? Why would God allow them to exist in Canaan? That's a good question. It seems that it's almost as if it's part of the plan. Why would God want such a thing to take place? The warning here about them, we understand the warning is not to make a covenant with any of the worshipers, but there's a distinction with regards to seven nations and other worshipers of idolatry. There's no commandment to kill the other peoples if they do not fight with us. If they don't fight with us, okay, that's it. But the seven nations, even if they want to make peace with us, we don't create a covenant, we don't have to make peace with them. We have to kill them unless they abandon their idolatry. That's going to become a key line in a little bit. And the matter is because they are at the center of idolatry, as we've just spoken about, and its first foundation. And anyone who has one of them come to his hand and he can kill him without danger, but does not do so, has transgressed a negative commandment. Wow, it's very, very harsh, very strong here. You have a mitzvah to kill these people from the seven nations. The Sefer Chinuch number 425, which is where he writes again about the mitzvah from in Devarim. Here it's no longer not creating a covenant. It's here that you have to go out and kill them. The commandment of killing the seven nations. You must kill them. They were the ones who held our land before we conquered it from them. They are the Canaanites, the Amorites, and to destroy them in any place that we find them. You shall totally destroy them. The Hebrew is interesting. When it says destroy them, annihilate them, the Hebrew is, in Devarim, in Deuteronomy 7:2, Hechrem Tachrim. You have to translate that word. Hechrem Tachrim. It's translated here and in most places as you shall destroy them, you shall annihilate them. But I'm not sure that's 100% correct. The root of this commandment is since these seven nations are the ones that began to do all types of idolatry, as we've spoken about already, and every abomination of God that God hates, and hence they are the main source of idolatry and the first foundation, we have to get rid of them. So it's a very harsh sort of fire and brimstone. When people critique the Torah, this is one of the sources of it. As I said, or I alluded to, it almost sounds like a form of ethnic cleansing. I don't care who they are. I don't care about their individual uniqueness. Destroy them all, kill them all, get rid of them all. That seems to certainly be the mitzvah in 425. And in fact, the Jewish sources themselves recognize a little bit of this discomfort. If you just flip a couple of pages, one page, we're in the third of the source sheet. The third page of the source sheet, the second source, is Devarim 2016, and the commentary of Rav Mecklenburg, the Katav V'Hakabbalah, 18th century rabbi into the 19th century, from Germany. He has an interesting comment on that. The text itself, the Torah, it says, speaking about destroying, in the towns of the peoples which the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage, you shall not let a soul remain alive. You have to go in and kill everyone. That's it. Across the board. So he has a whole discussion on this, and he notes that with regards to the other nations who might be engaged in idolatry, we don't have the same mitzvah of killing everyone, including the women and the children. But here, it seems that there's a mitzvah to kill also the women and the children. If you see in the bolded part, that it appears that this is a great cruelty, that you kill these innocent people, the women and the children, along with their fathers that sinned, and the fathers who had the ability to make conscious decisions of what they were doing, and they didn't want to make peace. They wanted to fight. But fine, but why kill the children? Ma pashu katanim. What sin did the children engage in? Chasri dat, they don't have in the intelligence or the ability to influence their surroundings. And what about the women? That she's under the control of the man. She didn't have much of a choice. And the opposite. Their nature, their actual nature, if the woman had a choice, they wouldn't go to war. The opposite. They would try to push for peace. Lama yargu, why do you have to kill them? Meaning, the Ketav Kabbalah says he also sees this mitzvah as very harsh and doesn't understand it. Why would you want to engage in killing? Now, he goes on and actually gives justification for his question. And we'll look at his answers in a little bit, which I'm actually going to disagree with a little bit. But you see that the rabbis themselves were uncomfortable with this nature. And so I think it's important to point out that while people attack the Torah for this fire and brimstone, it's an unfair criticism if you really understand the pshat, if you really understand this plain meaning of the text, as well as how the rabbis have interpreted it over the years. I just want to give you a few examples of what I mean, that where the rabbis have softened this whole concept of killing everyone in the 7 nations, the Canaanite nations. I think the most famous case, perhaps, is the Rambam, who tells us, ever since the time of Sennacherib, that all the nations of the world have been mixed up, and so we no longer could distinguish who is one of the 7 nations. It's not possible. There's no way of knowing who the 7 nations are. They are not the people who currently live in the land of Israel. It's totally mixed up, and so there is no mitzvah to kill people in the 7 nations because it doesn't exist anymore. They don't exist. They're all mixed up. The Rambam goes on to say, and I brought this source on the second page of the source sheet. The Rambam goes on to say in the Mishnah Torah, the law of the Malachim and their Milchamot, the kings and their wars, chapter 5, verse halacha 4. Mitzvah taseh lachrim shiva amamim. It is a mitzvah to, again, there's that word lachrim, translated as exterminate in this instance. It is a mitzvah to kill and destroy, exterminate the 7 nations, as it's written in the book of Deuteronomy, Sefer Devarim. Achrem tachrimem, you shall surely annihilate them. V'chol sheba liyado echad mehem v'lo haragu over b'lo taseh. And if you ever have the opportunity to kill one of these people of the 7 nations and you don't do it, you violated a mitzvah. As it said, lo tichech kol neshama. You should not allow a soul to live. However, he ends very pithily, but this is the whole essence of the halacha, kfar avad zikram. But they've already been destroyed. Their memory has already been destroyed. They don't exist anymore, so there is no mitzvah at this point in time. That's the first stage of sort of softening the mitzvah. It can't really be applicable anymore. It's no longer relevant in that case. I would point out, I mentioned a few times the word is lachrim, that also softens the mitzvah. Because the mitzvah, the word cherem, is not really, that's the root, cherem. It's not really destroy or annihilate. We're familiar with the word acherem. Acherem is when you put someone into cherem. You separate yourself from them. You prevent them from having an influence on you. You don't let them into your home. You keep a division between you and them. That might be really what the Torah is commanding, not to destroy them, not to kill them, but to make sure that they do not influence you. And this, I think, becomes an essential point of the whole mitzvah, and we're going to come back to this idea that that's really what the mitzvah of the 7 nations is to lachrim them, to put them into cherem, to not allow them to have an influence, to separate them from you. So you'll notice, actually, for example, if you read just above the Rambam, actually go to the first page of the sources, I apologize, the very bottom, when we're reading mitzvah number 425, he speaks about how it's a mitzvah to kill. And then he says there's the reason why is because the main source of idolatry, we have to get rid of it, and God hates it. The third line up from the bottom on the first page of the source sheet. And in this commandment of ours, about them to destroy them, there's also a benefit for us, that in their memory will be lost from the world so that we will not learn from them, from their deeds. And you can also take the teaching from that we don't turn to idolatry. If we're constantly reminding ourselves that we have to hate them and hate their deeds, so it will encourage us not to behave in their same way, that we won't be influenced by them. That's the real essence, seemingly, of the mitzvah, at least according to this one understanding. So that's a second softening. The first is that you can't fulfill the mitzvah, they've all been mixed up. The second one, maybe it's not even a mitzvah to kill, it's a mitzvah to make sure that there's not an influence on you. You can see an additional softening. I mentioned a few times that the Torah says there are these 7 nations that we have to get rid of. Well, the interesting thing is the Torah very seldom lists all 7 nations. In fact, let's go back. I'm jumping around a little bit. The third page of the source sheet. I apologize. The second page of the source sheet. The very bottom. The verse is in Shemot, when it mentions the 7 nations, V'shilachti lefanecha malach, and God says, I will send an angel in front, V'geirashti, and I will exile them. And by the way, in the book of Exodus and Shemot, it doesn't say that we have to get rid of them. In fact, it says the opposite. It says that God will remove them as a thorn in our side. But it's not a mitzvah for us, but it's almost a mitzvah for God. But put that aside for a moment. Gerashti et ha-Kanani, and I will expel the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, Hachiti, the Hittite, Haprizi, the Chevri, and the Yebusi, the Jebusite. There's only 6 there. And the truth is, the vast majority of times, the 7 nations are mentioned many, many times throughout the Torah. And I think in almost all instances, except maybe 1 or 2, it only lists 6 nations. It doesn't list all 7 of them. So why say 7 if you're not going to always list all 7? You only say the 6. So if you look just above that source, you'll see a Yerushalmi. Now, the various answers are given why there's 7. We're told that there's 7, but only 6 are always mentioned. One opinion, I think suggests that the land of the 7th was not so good. It's not the land flowing with milk and honey, so we don't count that. The Ibn Ezra says the 7th, the Girgashites, they're so small that you don't need to count them. They're too minimal. But there's a third opinion that's out there, and that's the Yerushalmi that I put up above. And actually, Rashi quotes this Yerushalmi. If you look at the Rashi at the very bottom of the page, on the verse we just read about God is going to send an angel ahead, and he'll exile the 7 nations, but then there's only 6 that are mentioned. Of Giyarashti et Kanani, Rashi says, Vav umot, there's only 6 nations, hem. Virgashti, Amadu Panai, Nehem Me'alav. So one of them, the Hagirgashi, the Girgashites, they already left. What does that mean? So what Rashi is referring to is the Yerushalmi, and that's what I put in the English right above. This is in line with what Reb Shmuel Bar Nachman says. Joshua, Yehoshua, when he's about to conquer the land, sent 3 proclamations to the Canaanites in the land of Israel prior to the Israelites entering the land. He says, whoever wishes to emigrate should emigrate. Whoever wishes to make peace should make peace, and whoever wishes to wage war should do so. The Girgashites emigrated, for they believed that the Holy One, blessed be He, and they went to Africa. This is in line with 2 Kings. To a land like your own, this refers to Africa. The Gibeonites made peace. That's the famous story about how the Gibeonites pretended to be a tribe from far away, and they made a peace treaty with Joshua. Joshua finds out later that it's false, but nevertheless adheres to and recognizes and respects the treaty that he has done. Already this is a weakening of everything we've just said before. The mitzvah number 93 says, don't create a treaty. And now here, the Yerushalmi says, but Yehoshua did make a treaty. And there were other examples of treaty. It says, kill everyone. But we have the case of the Girgashites. I quoted this thing, not just because it's interesting that they emigrated to Africa, but to show that there's an alternative out there, that not everyone had to be killed. There were other options that were out there. They could leave or they could make peace. The third option was that they go to war. But that's only the third option. By the way, for anyone who's historically inclined, there are some Greek works that support this Yerushalmi about the Girgashites, the seventh tribe, the seventh nation. Why they're not mentioned is because they left. That's the answer that Rashi offers us. But there is a book called The History of the Wars by Procopius of Caesarea, who was a Byzantine writer. Was a member of the court of Justinian I in the 6th century CE. So he writes about the Moors, early Semitic residents of North Africa, and relates that they are descendants of the Girgashites and the Jebusites as well, some others from the history of the Hebrews. This is in his work. These nations fled Yehoshua in front of as they were approaching. They couldn't settle in Egypt, which was overcrowded, and therefore they then moved on to Libya. He says that they even went beyond Libya, and they went as far as the Straits of Gibraltar, so Morocco. And they have lived even up to my time. Okay, this is now the 6th century CE. He's writing the history of them. And they used a Phoenician tongue. The Phoenician tongue, he says, is the tongue that existed in the land of Canaan. They built a fortress in Numidia in the Atlas Mountains. And in that place, there are 2 columns made of white stone near a great spring having Phoenician letters, which he says, again, Phoenician letters are Canaanite. And they are cut in them, and says in the Phoenician tongue, we are those who fled before the face of Joshua, the robber son of Nun. Meaning he sees Joshua as stealing their land, but we left. In other words, again, it supports the argument made in Yerushalmi that Yehoshua offered various options. You can make peace, you can leave, or you can go to war. So here's another softening. The mitzvah seems to say, go to war and kill everyone. And here it says, no, you could leave and you could even make peace, which seems to be in direct contradiction of mitzvah number 93. So we have to understand how that could possibly be. But we understand on a conceptual level that this makes sense, because the real beef we have with these 7 nations is not a genetic beef. It's not that we can't stand these people, that their ethnicity. That's not the problem. As I said before a few times, it's the idolatry, it's the evil ways that is most problematic. In fact, that's what the Ramban says. So now you can turn to the 3rd page of the source sheet. The Ramban is at the very top, Nachmanides. Lo tichrot lehem. You shall not cut a covenant with them. Ve'elohehem. And their gods. The Ramban sees, that's the Torah verse. Remember, the Torah verse says, don't cut a covenant with them and their gods. So the Ramban says, you have to be careful. Hizir shelo yichot lehem brit lachiyot mehem kol neshama. You should not make a covenant with them that sustains them and allows them to live, and their gods. Yazir shelo yichot lehem brit laniach avodah zar shalem. The real concern, don't make a covenant that allows their gods, their idolatry, their behavior to continue. That's the real problem. Ella shirasam v'yishbar matzvotehem. You have to destroy their pillars. V'techen sheyomar shelo yichot lehem brit v'yimelhem ka'achad. You might think there's 2 separate things. Don't make a covenant with them at all, and don't make a covenant with their God. No, these are together. The fact that it says also get rid of their pillars. The kavana, the intention is, so long as they are still engaged in all of their idol worship and all of their evil practices, which we've already referenced, as long as they're still engaged in that, then you cannot create a covenant with them. Aval, im kiblu alehem, but if they will accept upon themselves that they're no longer going to be engaged in idol worship, they're no longer going to sacrifice their children, they're no longer going to do all these things that we've spoken about, Rashai, it is permitted then to sustain them. They become the Ger Toshav. They become the residents of the land of Israel, who there is a mitzvah to, in fact, support. So there's the beef, as I said, is not with their genes, their DNA. The beef is with the behavior. And so therefore we understand why he is prepared to say, Yehoshua is prepared to say to them, either leave, or we will, okay, I'm back, I'm sorry about that, or we can make peace. That's one of the options. The way you have to read the Sefer Chinuch is, we cannot make a treaty with them so long as they're engaged in all their terrible behavior. If they leave that behavior, then indeed you can make a treaty with them, and perhaps it becomes even preferable in that regard. So that Ramban makes sense. Let's go now to the Ktav Kabbalah, which I mentioned before, who is so upset. He says, it seems so cruel to kill the women and the children. And then he gives a justification for that. I want to read him to develop the next point. Another softening, okay, to show another softening, that the text starts one way, but now we actually understand it quite differently. So as I said before, the verse says you should kill everyone. All, right? You shall not let a soul remain alive. And the Rav Mecklenburg, Ktav Kabbalah, says, doesn't that seem totally cruel? Why punish the women and the children? And he says, the answer is, the Meforshim say that they will still ruin, they will still destroy at their fundamental purpose and corrupt the souls for all time. They are so corrupt, more than any other nations. They're so enmeshed in their idolatry. They're so soaked in it. They're so deep in that swamp of idolatry and their behavior. No one will ever leave for all of their generations, ever. No one will ever be able to give it up in order to sheyachshir b'ma'asav, in order to sort of make kosher their deeds. And therefore they're all obligated to die, because they're never going to change. They're never going to give it up. So basically the Ramban says if they give it up, then there is no problem. You can make peace treaty with them. Well, we have to kill everyone, says Rav Mecklenburg, or at least he's explaining why some people say you have to. It's because they are never going to be able to give it, they'll never make a change. But then he gives another explanation. Ki atafa hanashim, and these women and children, they will become so accustomed to the ways of their idolatry that we will be influenced by them. They will teach us their ways, and they will lead us astray. And therefore, we also have then the rights to kill them. So he sees that there is a justification because, again, that we're going to be influenced by them. Now, the reason I brought him is because I disagree. I want to pick a little bit of a bone with him. He says that one of the understandings is that they will never be able to change. They'll never be able to leave that. And so he starts off by trying to soften this mitzvah, saying it seems so terrible, the killing, but we have to do it because of this particular instances. But as I said, I'd like to suggest that perhaps there's a mistake in that point that he's making. And one of the ways we could see it is, there are actual Canaanites that we know of that have changed. There are people of those 7 nations that not only could we overlook and not have to kill, but there are some that we also praise, that the Torah itself praises. The Gemara says that Tamar was an Israelite. How could she become an Israelite? From where did she become an Israelite? But the Gemara says she was an Israelite, and there are other sources that suggest there is an Israelite, she's an Israelite as well. But the pshat is Tamar, the famous story, Tamar and Yehuda. Tamar is a Canaanite. And yet Tamar If you go back to the story in Breshit, Tamar is, says Yehuda, more righteous than I am. And of course, her descendants become part of the lore of Mashiach, that the Messiah comes from Tamar, a Canaanite woman. So you already begin to see that the Torah and the rabbis understand that there is a possibility of transformation from this evil that they describe as the 7 nations of Canaanites to perhaps something more positive. We have other examples of this type of transformation, not just with the 7 nations. In fact, our whole eschatological story, our whole focus on Mashiach absolutely requires this, right? Shavuos is coming up, the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite, and of course from Ruth comes David HaMelech, comes King David, and comes Mashiach. So we have Tamar, we have Ruth, we have an amazing midrash that says even Haman, there's a mitzvah to kill all of the anyone who is Amalek, and we say that Haman was a descendant of Amalek, but he had his grandchildren learning in Bnei Brak, and there's some commentators who say that his descendants include Rabbi Akiva. It boggles the mind, but the rabbis went out of the way to show something of tremendous evil could potentially develop something very, very good. Something far outside the Jewish world could come to the closest, most intimate places and most important places in the Jewish world. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, right? We know where he's told that he's from Damascus. But he also seems to be in that area that is so overcome with Avodah Zarah. And of course, he becomes the trusted servant of Avram, and he becomes a tzaddik, a righteous person in his own right. But I think the clearest case is the case of Rachav. She is the prostitute living in the walls of Jericho, and Yoshua sends spies to scout out, and she rescues the spies and saves them. She is clearly a Canaanite woman. She's clearly in the category that on first glance is to be killed, but not only is she not killed, through her deeds, she is called a heroine. She saves us. She enables everything to take place. And the rabbis go out of their way to say that she becomes the grandmother of a number of important descendants, like the prophet Yechezkel, like the prophet Yirmiyahu, like Huldah, that she becomes this incredibly important figure in Jewish lore. So here's another softening. We started off by saying the mitzvah seems clear-cut, don't have anything to do with these people. The mitzvah in 425 gets even more strict. Not only don't create a covenant with them, make sure you kill them all. And then we have the rabbi saying it's not a mitzvah. If it is a mitzvah, it can no longer be performed. The real mitzvah is just not to be influenced by them. And now we've even gone to the other extreme. There are a number of people who we praise amongst these numbers of the 7 nations. What happened? How is this possible? So I want to sort of tie everything together by looking back for a moment at mitzvah number 93 and see how mitzvah number 93 is different than mitzvah number 425. Mitzvah number 93, the first page on the source sheet. The first page on the source sheet says, don't create a covenant. That's very different than don't kill. That appears in 425. Now, what was a Brit? I said the word Brit is important. It's not just a covenant. What does a Brit mean? So, if you look at this question historically, the treaties, the covenants of the ancient world were very often what we call suzerain covenants. A suzerain is a much greater power. In the Middle Ages, we would call them a feudal power and a vassal state. In other words, there's usually a very strong, large, almost empire type of country. And then there's other smaller nations. And the smaller nations come to the larger nation, and say, we would like your protection. We would like to create a treaty with you. The treaty is we, in a sense, give ourselves over to you. We're prepared to be influenced by you and follow your leadership, be guided by you in a whole series of different ways. In return, we ask that you protect us and that you don't go to war with us. You don't destroy us. That's what a Brit was in the ancient world. It's not a treaty the way we think of it today between two equal parties, and they both have mutual interests that they can work out through this treaty. The treaties of ancient, there's a lot of documentation of this. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman from Bar Ilan University has written a number of excellent articles showing this. Was about a weak, small, vassal state creating an agreement with a larger, more powerful sort of senior partner in the relationship that provided some type of protection in exchange for being able to influence the smaller country. That's why a Brit Milah makes much more sense. It is a covenant between us and God, but it's clearly not an equal partnership. Brit Milah is the proper model to understand the concept of Brit, of covenant. God is the senior partner. We're partners with God. And we ask to be influenced by God and inspired by God and guided by God. And in return, God makes us his people. So it's not a contract where I pay something and I get something equal in return for that. The Brit of the ancient world was between a junior partner trying to have a relationship with a senior partner. So it makes perfect sense that we can't have a covenant. You can't write a treaty of this sort with the seven nations. The seven nations, with engaged in idolatry as they were, the exact antithesis of God. We can't be the junior partner to God in one Brit, and the junior partner to idolatry, the idolatrous seven nations, on the other hand, and allow those things to coexist. It's theologically impossible. But there's a practical element to that as well. The seven nations were much larger. They were the majority people. So if we created that type of covenant with them, that meant we were signing over our ability to influence the world, signing over our unique values. In fact, the exact opposite. We're basically signing up to adopt idol worship. And so God says in Mitzvah number 93, do not sign a covenant with them. It's not a peace treaty like what we would think of today. It is do not sign a covenant where you're prepared to write away and give away your unique view of God and Judaism and the like and exchange it for idolatry. You just can't do that. It makes perfect sense, this mitzvah, number 93. We're not permitted to do that. We cannot be influenced by them. You see this again and again and again. The lachrim is to separate ourselves from them, to create a cherem. They either have to leave or we have to fight. We can't exist together, or we can create a peace agreement with them. The peace agreement is not a Brit. The Brit is us giving up our rights. A peace agreement, like in the case of the Gibeonites, for example, is us becoming the senior partner, us influencing them, us changing them, that they're giving up their evil practices and adopting the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, following the much more positive practice of the ethical behavior. That's what is permitted. So it's not about not having a covenant, an agreement with them. It's not an ancient, what I would say, the suzerain type of treaty, but it is possible if we are able to influence them, if we can change them, if we can influence them, if we can make them believers in God and followers of ethical monotheism and morality, then that, of course, is 100% permitted. That's why Dafka, we praise Rachav. She shows us the power to change. She grew up one way, and she becomes a hero in the opposite direction. We praise Tamar. It's the same idea. She left her environments. She overcame her environments. And of course, that's why Avram is such an inspiration. He, of course, not a Canaanite, but he leaves idol worshiping, in order to come to this land. That's what Rav Hirsch is getting at when he says Avram had to come to this land of extremity. It's to teach us an incredibly important lesson. Even this land that's so enmeshed in idol worship can change. When you get the brachot, there's two mountains in Eretz Yisrael, right? Hari Baba Hagrizim. One of them is totally covered, we're told, with greenery, and it's alive and it's beautiful. And then there's, right, Hagrizim that is deserted, it's desert-like. there's a choice. There's a choice between life and death. There's a choice wherever you are, even if you're one of the 7 nations of Canaan that is totally overcome with idolatrous ways, you can actually change that. You can actually have human free will to become different. That's what the message is really all about, I think, of this mitzvah. And indeed, our goal is to have the influence. We can't create a treaty with them where we give up our ability to influence or to be influenced only by them. What we are insisting on is we want to have the ability to influence them and inspire them to draw closer to God. I was teaching the laws of prayer recently, of tefillah, and I came across an interesting teaching of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. You'll know most probably that we call our main prayer the Shemona Esrei, which stands for the 18 benedictions, the 18 blessings that make it up. Of course, there's not 18 blessings in the daily prayer service. There's 19, and there's been for a long time, ever since Shmuel HaKatan, at the time of Rabban Gamliel and Yavne. There were a group of heretics, and the rabbis decided we have to add an additional blessing that speaks about these heretics, that they should not be successful. And so Shmuel HaKatan, a person filled with love and humility, was asked to write this very sharp, very antagonistic extra bracha against the heretics. And we keep it to this day. So we really have 19 blessings in the Shemona Esrei, not 18. So why not change the name of the prayer from the 18 to the 19? So Tzvi Yehuda Kook says, because at its core, it's still the 18. That additional blessing against the heretics, that's only temporary. Our goal is not to destroy the heretics, but to bring them back, to inspire them to return. And so the real core, real essence of the 18 prayers are the 18. That 19th, it's been a long temporary. It's been for, a couple thousand years, but the goal is to get rid of it. And that's what that really is all about. So now, if you will, humor me as I conclude. Turn to the third. I'm sorry about that also, because that's not what I'm going to say. Turn to the second, we're going to jump around a little, the second page of the source sheet. And at the top of the page, the first full paragraph, this is still in mitzvah number 425. And I alluded to this before, because the Sefer Chinuch says, in mitzvah number 93, why is it that these nations exist? Right? Why did God allow them to exist? Why did God create them in the first place? And he said he's going to answer that question in mitzvah number 425, which he's now going to do. And it should not at all be asked, since their end was to be completely destroyed from the world, why these evil nations were created. As we already know, that permission is given to the hand of man to be good or evil, and that God does not force a person to one of them. And since this is so, we can say that these 7 nations corrupted their own actions and acted evilly to the point that they were all liable for destruction and death. But at the beginning of creation, why create them if it becomes a mitzvah to destroy them? At the beginning of creation, they were also fit for good. They had full potential. It was human free will. And the Sefer Chinuch develops this point, which I think is the real essence of the mitzvah. And we will rely on this reason for the commandments of the destruction of Amalek. I already spoke about Amalek, how there's a mitzvah to destroy them. But at the same time, we know that it's possible that someone can break free from Amalek. The example I gave already of his grandchildren living in Bnei Brak. He gives us a slightly different case. If we want, we can also say that it's possible that they had at one particular time a time of being proper. And because of that one time, they merited to be created. In other words, even if they have a lifetime of evil, centuries of evil, there might have been one moment where they contributed something positive, and for that one moment alone, it was worth it for the creation. It's an incredibly radical point, an optimistic point, I think, also. They merited to be created. Or maybe we could say that from all of them, one proper man came out, and they merited to be created for his sake, right? The sake of Rachav, the sake of Tamar, the sake of individuals. It is like the matter of what they said in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that was from that they said that we were. It's a misprint here. The descendants of Amalek, as I've already referred to. One of them was Antonius, Atina, and we'll look at a Gemara about him in a moment, who he was. And it is not possible for the Creator to create many people for the sake of one, as he, blessed be he says, does not toil. He does everything that he desires. And therefore, if a person is created, it was for that purpose. They were actually created. Blessed be he who is the one who understands all our needs, knows the needs of others for the specific one, that he should create them all for his sake. Then maybe it's even just for one person that an entire nation could potentially be created. And who is this Atina, this person that I want to sort of develop just for a moment? So let me just give you the beginning of the Gemara, which is sort of, I think, an interesting Gemara. But what I really want to see is that which comes after it. So if you turn now the page to the third page, and I have the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, page 10, the second, right, 10b. So here was this individual by the name of Antonius, Atina. The Gemara relates, Antonius had a certain daughter. I'm just bringing this first part just so you get a little bit of a taste of him and his relationship with Rebbe Yehuda. He had a very close relationship with Rebbe Yehuda. If you look at some of the secular sources, this individual actually doesn't seem to be such a nice person. It seems he might have, if he is in fact the same Roman leader who I think he is, actually is fairly cruel. But is perhaps a different person, or he at least has this very positive relationship with Rebbe Yehuda. Gemara relates, Antonius had a certain daughter whose name was Gira, who performed a prohibited act. She engaged in some type of promiscuous behavior. Antonius sent a rocket plant, a gargira, to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to allude to the fact that Gira had acted promiscuously, gar. Everything is going to be an allusion, a hint here, by the gifts that they sent to one another. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sent him coriander, kuzbarta, which Antonius understood as a message to kill, to kos, right, his daughter, Barta, right, using the Aramaic. So I hope Rabbi Yehuda was not just sending him a vegetable, but if he was sending him coriander, Antonius interpreted as that he should kill his daughter, and that she was liable to receive death penalty for her actions. Antonius sent him leeks, karti, to say, I will cut her off. I will do so. I will be cut off, if I do so. I will have karit if I kill my daughter. So Rabbi Yehuda then sent him a lettuce, a chasa, which means you should have mercy, chas, take pity on her. Again, let's hope that this whole conversation maybe had a few extra words. I'd be nervous to take too much behavior based simply on whether or not I receive a lettuce one day or the other. That's their relationship. The Gemara has a lot more about this individual, and then it goes near the end with the following stories. The Gemara relates, every day Antonius would minister to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He would feed him and give him drink. There are stories that I've skipped over. He would give him gold. He really loved Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wanted to ascend to his bed, Antonius would bend down in front of the bed and say to him, ascend upon me to your bed. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said in response, it's not proper to treat the king. Antonius seemed to have the power of the king in Judea at that point in time. He was appointed by the Romans. It's not appropriate to treat a king with such disrespect. Antonius said, oh, that I were a mattress under you in the world to come, in Olam Haba. On another occasion, Antonius said to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, will I enter the world to come? Do I have the opportunity to Olam Haba? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said to him, yes. Antonius said to him, but isn't it written, apparently he knew some Torah in the book of Avadia, there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esav. And that interpretation was that you would not have someone from the house of Esav, he's a Roman representative, Rome is the descendants of Esav, that you would not have Romans would not be able to merit the world to come. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says the verse is stated with regard to those who perform actions similar to those of the wicked Esav, not to people like you. Now, whether or not he deserved Olam Haba or not is not really the question. For me, the point that Rabbi Yehuda is saying is if you followed in the evil deeds of Esav, then that's a problem. But if you're simply a descendant of Esav, that's not a problem. If you behave well, this is also taught in the Breita, the Gemara continues. From the verse, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, one might have thought that this applies to everyone descended from Esau, irrespective of an individual's actions. Therefore, the verse states of the house, the Beit Esau, to indicate the verse is stated only with regard to those who continue in the ways of Esau and perform actions like Esau. It's not genes, it's not genetics. It's not a problem with the 7 nations because they're Jebusite or Hittite or anything along those lines. That's not the problem. The problem is if they continue along the path of idolatry, which included all these terrible things, then that has to be destroyed. But the real goal is actually to transform them, to bring them along such that they give it away and they are influenced by the Jewish people. That's why I say the real political message derives from the spiritual message. The political message is that you don't have to look at anyone as permanent enemies. There's no one who is irredeemably evil. There's no one who can't change. Now, many people don't change, and of course you have to be aware of that. But we came to the most evil place in the world to teach us and to teach the world that everything can be redeemed. If we just redeemed, I don't know which country I'm going to say, Sweden, if we just redeemed a place that Denmark, everything is very happy-go-lucky all the time. There's no great innovation in that teaching. The innovation is to come to the most evil place in the world and to transform that, to teach people that they are not bound by their genes, that they can, in fact, transform and change themselves. That's the ultimate message. And of course, what does this sound like? When the Sefer Chinuch says you should look at people and realize that every person eventually has their moment. And you could have created an entire evil nation for the sake of one righteous person. It reminded me at least of Ben Azai. Ben Azai in the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avot. This is the last page of the source sheet. Hu haya omer. He used to say, Al tihi boz lechol adam. Never scorn any individual. V'al tihi maflig lechol davar. And don't discriminate against anything. She'ein lecha adam she'ein lo sha'ah. There is no person that does not have one great moment in them. You never know. You just never know. That's something Rav Shlomo Karlibach used to say. You never know. There might be something in a person who looks the most evil, wicked, lost, unimportant person in the world. And there will always be one moment in their life where they could do something amazing and incredible. The Gemara that speaks about the executioner. Can you imagine the executioner? This is his day job. He kills people every day. And he's going to save Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion. Not save his life, but eliminate the amount of pain he will suffer from as he's about to die in the story of the 10 martyrs. And the Gemara there says, every person has their moment. Perhaps that one moment he transformed his entire existence to get Olam Haba. Despite everything he did before then, he was able to change at the last moment. Ben Azai says, there is not any person who does not have his sha'ah, his hour, his moment. Ein lecha dvar she'ein lo makom. And there is not any place, there's not anything that doesn't have its place in this world. Everything has potential. And our mission, our goal, is to try to help people bring out that potential. If we fail, the result, unfortunately, is that we have to go to plan B, which is the destruction, which is the expulsion, which is we can't afford to be influenced by it. And so therefore we have to separate from it any way we can. But plan A is to transform it, is to mekadesh it, is to change it and transform it completely. I just brought 2 additional sources on the Pirkei Avot that might develop this point a little further, a little bit more poetically than I've just done. The first, Be'er Mayim Chaim. So tells the story of Hayam Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokeichem, that God is eventually going to choose a place, Yerushalayim, where the Beit HaMikdash is going to be built. But what about those 14 years before when sacrifices took place on the Bamot, all these other sort of private altars around the country? And he asks the question, he says, wait a second. For those 14 years, Was it good or bad that they were in operation? You see, if there was something bad about them, so then we should have never done them, even without a Beit HaMikdash. If it's bad, it's bad. And if there's something good about them, why not keep them even at the time of the Beit HaMikdash? And he answers that question in the second to last line. Ein lecha davar she'ein lo makom. Different times, different needs, different necessities, different realities. There's always an opportunity to do something good, but not everything will be applicable at every single moment. And then he ends by pointing out that God is very often called makom. That there's no place in this world that is not without God, and there's a piece of the world, every piece of the world in God. Every place that you come to, the reason why you should not scorn it is because there's an element of God in that, of godliness. And our challenge is to elevate it and find that piece of Kedusha. The Pele Yotzitz is the last source, bizayon, right? Do not scorn anything. Do not view anything with disgrace. Don't scorn any individual, because there's not any one person who does not have his moment in the sun. What we want to say, their intention is even someone who is a lowly individual, don't scorn them. And a Jew, shame, and don't disgrace him. He's created B'Tselem Elokim. That's how God created Adam, human beings. And if you scorn, therefore, a person, you are scorning God. That if you disgrace someone, you're disgracing the Shekhinah, because every person has an element of the Shekhinah within them. And there's therefore no makom, there's no space, there's no room to disgrace a Jew. It could be anyone, truth be told, though. As I've written before, that no Adam should be disgraced. Because usually what happens if you begin to disgrace a person, you're really disgracing yourself. He adds a little psychology here. When you disgrace someone, it's because you're really sick and tired of the quality and the moom and the failure in yourself. And this is the way of the world. That all the flaws that a person has, he's able to see it in others. And the flaw that he has in himself, he understands that there's extenuating circumstances, and so he can justify and explain away why he has this flaw. But he sees it in someone else. He doesn't try to find the extenuating circumstances of why they may behave the way they behave. That's the way of the world. But that's something that we have to avoid. We have to try to find the positive of everyone. And so I end by where I began, by saying this mitzvah is not to create a covenant with the 7 nations because they're so evil, so wicked. But the real message is not to be influenced by them, but to take upon the challenge to try to inspire them to fulfill their potential and to return to become fully Tzelem Elokim, to be created in the image of God as God fully intended. Everyone should have a good night and a good Shabbos.